Hello, everyone, and welcome to King Arthur Day. And this is the first of two recordings that I'm doing today. And I have an illustrious panel, a round table, you might say, of guests gathered with me, gallant knights, one and all, Black Horse and British Berean. How are you doing, gentlemen?
Hello.
I'm feeling not well. Quite so brave today.
Let's see if we can. Bring your bravery levels up. Being inspired by the legend, the myth, and I suppose we can discuss the historical figure of King Arthur.
The 100% genuine,
and this stream
historic.
Yes, the most reputable figure that we know from ancient times. Let's, in this stream, talk about the rise of King Arthur, and that both means the origins of the myth and also events that tend to happen earlier in the retellings of the King Arthur legend. And then the second stream that will be broadcast a little bit later today, we'll talk about the fall of King Arthur in various ways. So what are the very origins? When does Arthur first crop up?
So Arthur is like so the historical Arthur is some kind of post-Roman British or monarch of the Britons, the tribe. At least this is the kind of the best theory, and he's historically placed somewhere between sort of 400 and 600 during the period where the Saxons are migrating to Albion, and he is, as best understood,
Albion meaning what?
Albion meaning the British Isles, England now, and Arthur is, depending on who you believe, placed somewhere in either sort of Wales or the north of England, and he is a monarch of a tribe who's facing the arrival of the Saxons. And this is the historical figure as best people can figure it. But the legend of Arthur kind of it's during this period where the pagan story of King Arthur kind of originates. And it's a story of the king kind of in the shadows of the broken Roman Empire, something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm actually someone who's a bit skeptical of of making a hard distinction between the pagan and the Christian origins of Arthur. One thing that is worth noting, whether or not Arthur was a historical figure, is that part of the history of this period in which Arthur is supposed to have lived is that the Britons who have lived in the country have inherited Christianity largely from the Romans. They were mostly Christianized before the Romans departed in power from Britain, and the Saxons and Angles and Jutes who are attacking the country from the north were not so Christianized, and so part of the conflict of the period is that the sort of Christianized peoples or pre-Christianized peoples of Britain are being forced to the outskirts of the island, to Wales and to the south west, and so Arthur as a real or mythological figure is a leader of these sort of beleaguered Britons as against the pagan Saxons and Jutes and Angles.
So you see this in a lot of the mythological stories about his so-called exploits. Many of them feature characters engaging in sort of pagan magic as the villains in the stories, right? And very much the idea of paganism is kind of at the fringes of a lot of the Arthur stories that you have read. Very frequently, they're interpreted in the modernized versions as the Druids, who are the keepers of this pagan magic, just kind of on the edges of civilization.
Yeah,
so you mentioned.
It's worth saying. I said the Romans were Christianized. It's worth pointing out that they were Christianized in a sort of partial sense. So that's what I mean by it difficult to pass out a like pagan and Christian component of the Arthurian legends. Is that If these things do come from like remnants of stories and historical figures from that period, there's a good chance that these two things were just so blended together in many places that it's really difficult to go like, oh yeah, this is the pagan myth and this is the Christian myth.
Yeah,
You
for example,
mentioned-
if we look at the origin story, the story of how Arthur is chosen to become king, the earlier version of this story is the Lady of the Lake, which is clearly a kind of pagan reference, holds aloft the sword of Excalibur. And this is definitely a more pagan story. And later on, this story gets washed by the Victorians and maybe some even earlier figures to a sword and a stone, because they don't like the concept of the goddess in the water, right?
So the Lady of the Lake account is that what he discovers the lady in the lake and she gives him the sword, and that is the reason that he becomes king.
Yeah, so the Lady of the Lake account, depending on the version, either he goes himself or Merlin takes him to the Lake of Avalon, and the lake is some kind of gateway to the spirit world. And the Lady of the Lake holds aloft the sword Excalibur, which signifies by the will of God or the will of the gods that he is to become king of the Britons.
Whereas the pulling the sword out of the stone, he comes across the stone and he's the only one who's able to pull it out, and then Merlin declares that therefore he's the rightful king.
Well, and the sword and the stone account, it's broadly understood in the community that the man who pulls the sword from the stone will become king. Whereas in the Lady of the Lake account, nobody, perhaps Merlin, but not the broad community, there isn't an anticipated king who will pull the sword, the sword out of the Lady of the Lake. It's an event that happens exogenously.
Mm-hmm. But it's interesting in either case that it's the sword that gives the right to. It's a sort of might makes right almost symbol, right? The person wielding the sword is the rightful king, and I think it's fair to say that the early stories really emphasize this king for his ability in battle, that he goes to battle and kills lots of people, and this is really a story of the formation of the nationhood as winning in military might. That's kind of the focus of the stories, is this amazing hero character.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the stories, he tames the territory of Britain. So he fights against these kind of pagan elements at the fringes, the druids, and often magical creatures, and often not. Sometimes Arthur himself, and sometimes his knights, depending on the particular story. And I guess I'm not sure how early Mordred appears in the record. I'm not sure if he's an original feature or not.
I don't think original, and you mentioned the earliest dates for, the likely dates that if there was a historical figure, which is, I think,
somewhat doubtful.
I would say doubtful.
Yeah, it doesn't seem. Well, it's possible there were historical figures that have been blended together, right? So
yeah,
there almost certainly would have been heroic Britons during the period in which the Britons were being forced to the margins of the island, some of which would have been kings, and so.
But if the period of history we're talking about is the sort of 5th, 6th century, and we don't have even the first remote mentions of anyone called Arthur until the 9th or 10th century, so that's hundreds of years later.
Yeah, although that's not that surprising. There's very little document preservation on the British Isles during the period. Unfortunately, the British Isles are an especially poor climate for preserving cloth, paper, etc. So there's almost nothing from the there's almost nothing non-metallurgical, non-stone from the archaeological record for that period.
Yes, not surprising, but nonetheless, the chances of preserving accuracy through
are very low.
history over
Yeah, it's very.
hundreds of
I mean,
years.
but one of the things to add to what Black Horse just said is that even like the records we do have from that period, a good number of them are European records from like communications made between the Pope or kings on the continent to those in Britain, rather than records that we have within Britain itself. So there are like numerous figures from that period that we just don't know about, or that they're mentioned like once, even though they were probably quite important figures.
Well, and one of my favorite parts about the way the Arthur myth is framed is he's called the once and future king. So in some ways, it almost fits the narrative elegantly that there is no specific historical figure, but historical figures like Arthur almost certainly existed.
What do you take that to mean, once and future king?
Well, the idea from the history is that you have this great king who's able to achieve a great deal within his life, to unite a band of men around a singular purpose, and live in a manner that is both fierce and virtuous. But ultimately that king dies, and those who succeed him are in no way men of the same character, and so the achievements which he built during his short life are broken apart. But the idea is that either in a physical sense, when the country is in need of men of such character, that they will come again, or from a Christian perspective, where Arthur is a kind of Christ archetype. The genuine future king is Jesus when he comes again in judgment to push back all the forces of evil to the ends of the realm.
Right.
Yeah, there's a typological argument that argues that the type of Arthur is a recurrent feature through British history, and then there's a Christian religious argument, and then there's a pagan version of this argument that argues that Arthur himself travels to Avalon and will return at some to rescue the Britons in their hour of need or whatever.
If you read Thomas Mallory's account of all the Arthurian legends, which is the main big volume in, I think it's the 1500s or something like that, from which almost all the modern versions are derived. In his introduction, he talks about this concept that was quite popular during the medieval era, known as the nine worthies, who were basically nine then considered historical figures, all of whom were worthy of veneration and looking after. And these are split into pagan, Christian, and ancient Jewish figures. And Arthur is considered sort of one of the nine worthies. The others are like, I think of the Christian figures, you have Charlemagne, and I always forget who the other Christian figure is. For the pagans, it's Hector of Troy, Alexander, and Caesar. And then the Jewish ones are, I believe Joshua is one of them, and Judas Maccabeus, and I can't remember the third. The idea is that these are archetypes of brave men, and so the idea of once and future king for Arthur, I think, is quite closely connected to this wider idea of men of great ability and character.
Yeah, well, I was reading about the fall of Constantinople quite recently, and you have an almost identical argument made there, where there's a legend in the there's a legend that suggests that the last king of Constantinople, rather than dying at the hands of the Turks, was transformed by an angel into marble and is part of the Hagia Sophia, and will demarbleize at some point and lead the Greeks to conquer the city again. You see this idea of the returning king returning from kind of the other world in a lot of mythology of a similar kind of era.
So one of the earliest sources we have is the Annales Cambriae, which I believe means the Annals of Wales, and it describes Arthur's battles where Mordred fell, or Medraut, And it's described that Arthur carried the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ for 3 days and 3 nights on his shoulders, and the Britons were the victors. So extremely Christianized version of Arthur already in some of the earliest accounts.
Yeah, I mean,
Then,
that's one of the reasons I say it's really hard to parse like a pagan and Christian version out of this, because much like Beowulf, in fact, the extant sources of these kind of figures are all Christianized, and so you really end up reading into it what you want, depending on what preference you have for the period. Like if you're someone who thinks that there was this really strong pagan Britain that was then suppressed and propagandized by Christians, you'll say, oh, Arthur was a pure pagan and all of this Christian stuff's been added on. Whereas if you come from a more Christian perspective, you can have a range of views from, oh, it was partially paganized, to no, this was all completely Christianized even at the time.
Well, you could even make the argument that it was a Christian myth that was paganized for the broad culture, because you're quite correct to call the period sort of semi-Christian, where a lot of pagan practices are kind of interwoven with the way that Christianity was practiced in kind of the late Roman period.
So there were some Christian communities in the 4th century, but it wasn't until the 6th or 7th century that there was a really systematic attempt to Christianize Britain, right?
Well, I mean, there's that issue, but also the Christian communities that existed had picked up a lot of the pagan customs from around them. Much the same as if you were a figure from the 26th century observing us, you would say that most Christians of the period have like this very strong progressive influence, and you'll say like there are elements of progressivism that are recognizably not Christian, that are integrated into the way that they're living their lives.
Yeah, I agree with that. If the West becomes re-Christianized within the next couple of centuries, this period will be a really strange one, where even some of the more faithful figures within the Christian Church will have obviously progressive traits to them that like later Christians will look back on and say, oh yeah, this is obviously syncretism of some sort here. Which is strange to think, because that's from our own era rather than the Arthurian period, but the same principle I think applies.
Yeah, and if you were looking back on a myth from this period, it would be very difficult to parse whether it was a progressive myth or a Christian myth, if the myth becomes progressively Christianized by some future, civilization, right?
One thing that's also, I think, important to consider is we don't, as Christians, think that human beings began as pagans. The gospel was given in a seed form to Adam and Eve in Eden, and so what we would expect to see is degraded versions of that in human cultures that had grown outside of the influence of God, and of course human beings have the knowledge of God within them. We simply suppress it in our sin. So there's an expectation that pagan cultures, although they have invented their own religious systems and beliefs and worship false gods, will retain elements of truth and elements of the Christian religion within those pagan systems, which are then brought to their fullness with the reception of the gospel and the spread of true faith.
So the net of this is very difficult to parse. BB had it right out of the gate. Parsing Arthur as a pagan myth or parsing Arthur as a Christian myth is kind of it's very difficult to pull that apart, and you're probably better to read it as something of both at the same time.
Let's move on to the 12th century. British Berean, you've described yourself as a Geoffrey of Monmouth respecter. What can we learn from Geoffrey of Monmouth? What does he write about King Arthur?
He wrote a great deal about British history in general, all of which is entirely true, completely unquestionable, and and we should accept his version. I mean,
Yeah.
Geoffrey of Monmouth wrote one.
He
of
had
the
a time
earliest-
machine, right?
Yeah, he did. He
So-
did. In fact, that's how he knew all of these things, including
Right.
including about. I'm trying to think what the most obscure thing that Geoffrey of Monmouth wrote about. I think he wrote about the Trojans emigrating to Britain and establishing our country. So, yeah, so Monmouth wrote a history of the British people, and included in that history was Arthur, and a lot of, well, some of the earliest stories that we have about Arthur in a kind of collected form come from him, and yeah, his writings were the sources for a lot of the later elaborations on the myths. I like Geoffrey of Monmouth. His writings are very enjoyable, and even if they're of like dubious historical value.
Yeah, I'm actually learning quite a bit about them. My children are currently reading recordings of a bunch of his stories of the early history of Britain, and I never learned any of this as a child. It's quite interesting.
Yeah, I personally was never taught anything other than the most vague details about the early history of Britain in school. I don't know what it was like for you, Luke, but most of the stuff that Geoffrey of Monmouth talks about is incredibly interesting for children, and it just doesn't get taught.
Mostly what I remember was being taught that Britain was had its history comprised of a series of invaders and invasions, which, looking back on it, I think was partly intended
Somewhat
to
motivated.
imply yes, that there's kind of is no such thing as a native population, that we should kind of just see ourselves as a transient people who happen to be living here at the moment, and should expect further waves of invasion.
Yeah.
I think it's quite interesting that modern British history is taught from the anti-Arthur perspective, right? The perspective of King Arthur is the subject of the invasions, right? The people who were here, the people whose world is being disrupted. Interestingly, it takes the position that the people who were here were Christians being disrupted by invading pagans, which is very much the opposite of what you get taught narratively in sort of public education.
Yeah,
Yes.
absolutely. And also, to add to that fact of most of British history being taught as a series of invasions, the invasions that are taught about tend to be the Roman invasion, and then 1,000 years are skipped, and then it's 1066. And the entire period that Geoffrey of Monmouth is largely writing about is that period between the Roman occupation and the invasion of William of Normandy.
Are you suggesting that something happened in 600 years?
Yeah, exactly. Here's a millennia of British history that just it's pretended that nothing happened.
I think I do remember it being mentioned that there was like Saxons and Normans and Angles, and these were the various groups, but it was sort of viewed that each of them arrived with their own religion and worldview and set of practices, and it was almost a postmodern perspective of these are all just kind of power plays with the culture arriving as a secondary factor.
That's all right. The Canadian version of British history taught in public school begins with Queen Elizabeth. So,
okay, fair enough. Well, most of British history tuition is just 1939 to 1945. This is like, all of history happened in 5 or 6 years.
No. If you come from Canada, then you have to learn about how the evil English came and destroyed the natives. So there's a great deal of discussion about this long, this 100-year period where we were doing evil things. So
should we return to Arthur?
Fair enough.
Our mourning about our history.
But in some ways, to bring it back to how the story of Arthur is taught over the years and right now is, as you say, the early versions of Arthur focus on him as a positive, heroic figure who's just the best swordsman ever, and as time goes by, the presentation of Arthur becomes, I would argue, more complex, more mixed. There's different focuses.
Yeah, well, I think as we evolve to that, it is essential to understand that Arthur is presented as the leader of a Brotherhood of the Sword, right? So he's not just presented as a man who is a singularly exceptional warrior. He is presented as the head of the Round Table, in order of knights who are coalesced around a round table, indicating a kind of equality, and who have great martial virtue, right? And most of the Arthurian legends are actually about the Knights of the Round Table rather than about Arthur himself. So if you pick up an Arthur story, it's very likely that you'll see, Lancelot going off and doing something, or one of the other famous knights going off at, Arthur doesn't actually go on the quest for the Holy Grail. He sends his knights.
Is the Round Table supposed to imply that everybody at the table is equal? Because you use the term the head of the Round Table, but
yes,
the Round Table does not have a head, and yet it's pretty clear that in all of these that Arthur is king. So is this the original version of all knights are equal, but some
are more equal than others?
No, I'd say no. I think there are actually two features of the Round Table which make it quite unequal. Most of the seats are equal in that the table's round. People sitting around the table. But if you look at any depictions of it, and of course the way that the myths are described, the first place that is unequal is the king's seat. The king is the one who does ultimately direct his knights toward their quests. And if you look at any of the artworks of the Round Table, you'll always see King Arthur sitting in a throne. His seat is distinct from the rest of the knights. It's not like he's just blended in the mass of faces around this table.
Which one's Arthur? We can't tell. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And then the second seat, which is worth noting, is the seat known as the Siege Perilous, or the seat of peril, the perilous seat. And this is the seat that is vacant and is reserved for whichever knight is worthy enough to make the quest for the Holy Grail and be successful. So this is the other sort of notable feature about the Round Table, is that there's this seat reserved for the kind of virtuous knight, who isn't Arthur, interestingly enough.
It just seems like a propaganda tool to me.
Well,
it
I
appears
also
in the
think
12th century. It's a pretty early part of the myth making, but this is purely a gesture, a meaningless, pointless. If I was to criticize King Arthur, I'd say his gesture
was a bit hollow.
Yeah.
Well, it's a symbol intending to display more than simply the equality of people sitting around it. I mean, that the fact that it's a circle is, I think, important in that a circle tends to represent completion, and the knights are supposed to be the fullness of the realm. And
Roman de Brute, 1155, around the table all were equal and no one was better than another. Layamon's Brute in 1190, he had a round table made where no man shall sit higher than another. It's pretty clear.
I actually think
symbolism is equality.
Yeah, I actually think a lot of the Arthur myth plays positively and negatively with the symbolism of equality. So, for example, two of the stories of the downfall of Camelot are a direct consequence of Arthur's over-egalitarianism. So one of the key stories of the collapse of Camelot centers around Lancelot falling in love with Guinevere, the king's wife, and engaging improperly with her. We'll call it that. Another is Galahad going off and taking many of the knights on this quest for the Holy Grail, and they actually find it and they never return. And in some ways, the kind of egalitarian system which is offered to these knights has in it the seeds of the fall of Camelot. It has this kind of great high period to it, but it also has this. It invites the undermining of the authority of the king.
Could it be described that maybe there's like an explicit egalitarianism but an implicit inegalitarianism, in that, you know, the features I described as being distinct are there, but as you also pointed out, Luke, a lot of the myths surrounding it are very explicit in saying all are equal, and so there's this tension there between the obvious truth of the fact that not like that there are certain respects in which the knights around the table are not equal, but it's constantly being explicitly stated that they are equal. That
Interesting.
leads to this downfall eventually, I suppose.
Well, I just think it's a theme that's played with by many of the authors, right? Because
I get the impression that the French authors take it more in that direction that you're talking about, where the relationship between Lancelot and Guinevere, this illicit kind of adulterous relationship, appears, and that didn't happen in the earlier English traditions.
I'm glad we can blame the French for the faults of Arthur's kingdom.
Well, but then the French here are taking the reactionary position against the egalitarianism in the 13th century. So
yeah, but isn't Lancelot supposed to be French?
Oh, is he?
Yeah, he's supposed to be one of the knights who comes from France to join the Round Table, and then falls in love with the king's wife.
That gadabout, that absolute.
The French.
All right. Well, we can all unite in opposition to Lancelot, but I think the tradition that then developed. So to talk about how the Arthurian myth changes over time, that version of the story is much more where the king is this frail secondary character, and Lancelot is even though he's doing something that from a Christian perspective is sinful and immoral, he actually is the heroic.
Yes, he's much more vital.
So I go back on my claim that the French stories are based, and actually they were accidentally undermining the equality that they probably thought was great. Okay, so that's the round table. Was there anything else worth talking about in Geoffrey of Monmouth? I feel like I cut that section short. Or are we happy to progress?
I mean, there's always more worth talking about in Geoffrey of Monmouth, but let's progress to other things.
So, well, to jump way forwards, you mentioned Malory, who's the 15th century writer, and he wrote Le Morte d'Arthur, which as I understand it, was one of the first texts published in Caxton's printing press. This was the beginning of publication, and it was extremely popular. So what was the contents of Le Morte d'Arthur? I mean, stories about King Arthur and the Round Table, I guess, pulled together from, I think, both sources, that there was this French and British traditions of Arthur, and a kind of
I believe so.
To synthesize them.
I've only read parts of it, so I couldn't tell you exactly what all of it's about. But it's long, and
yes,
he does seem to have pulled together a huge number of different Arthurian accounts into a single volume.
But it was more so a flex on, now we have printers, we can just publish as much.
Yeah, I don't have to hire a monk to write my hundreds of chapters of Arthurian legend.
Yeah,
I mean,
it's suggested that he pulls from many sources going back all the way to the 5th century. Whether that's really true or not, there appears to be a scholarly debate about. So it's kind of hard to say. I think what he was trying to do is try to get as wide a view of Arthur as possible. But like BB, I haven't read the whole thing. I've only read pieces of it, and I mean, it is very long. It's 21 cantons. So
I guess
We'll
if
come
you
back
were
to
in the
Arthur
early
Day next
16th
year. I'll read
century,
the whole thing.
you'd basically in the time period, if you were rich enough to buy a book or try to put a library together, you'd basically have this next to the Bible. And
well,
that was your whole
originally it's
reading material.
divided into
Canterbury Tales as well.
originally it's divided
Canterbury
into
Tales.
8 books. So you'd have to be rich enough not to buy one book, but to buy 8 books.
Wow. Okay.
And the earliest copies are very elaborate with art. So, and that must have been extremely expensive to do on the printing presses of the time. So, you're looking at kind of a luxury item, probably purchased by people who, are looking at it in terms of the ideals of chivalry.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Can we dig into that a little bit? Because this is obviously a lens of the period that the chivalric code, and I think it explores questions about honor and bravery and what the rights and wrongs. It's kind of a nuanced take, very different from the early stories of jingoistic rah go Arthur. This is all the characters are grayer, and there's ups and downs in their story, emotional intensity, that sort of thing.
Yeah, a lot of them have to do with the idea that in the course of some kind of quest, their commitment to honor and commitment to practicing chivalric ideas is challenged in one way or the other, right? So you go on a quest and you have an opportunity to do something dishonorable in order to advance your quest, and you go through the temptation, and you go through the temptation to be drawn away. Probably you do something wrong along the way, and you have that kind of story arc to many of these sub stories.
Mm-hmm. I mean, they are kind of thrilling story. There's lots of great elements for storytelling. I know to a degree people would have thought of it as history, but in a way I think of it as like world building. You put
I think they're quite
recognizable
didactic.
characters together.
I think they're intended to teach chivalric ideals. I don't think they're, and I think people at the time would have understood them as intended to teach. The same way as when you read the Bible, you might, well, I would read it as believing I'm reading history, but believing I'm reading history recorded in a way which is intentionally didactic, right? You read the story of whatever it is, Joshua conquering the Promised Land. It's not a military manual. It's not a strict history. It is intended to teach you about how to relate properly to God. And I think in the same way, the stories in Le Morte d'Arthur are intended to teach you how to be a good knight or how to be a good noble. And the people who read them may or may not have believed that they were narratively true, but I think they're very obviously didactic in nature.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that view. In fact, one other thing I remember from the from Mallory's, like, I can't remember, it's just a preface or prologue to them, other than the fact about the 9 worthies that I mentioned earlier, is that he emphasizes to his readers that it is good to learn about these tales because Arthur is British, and the British care about the sort of British worthy. And he even makes an offhanded remark about the fact that some people think that some of these things are dubiously historical or mythological. So it's quite clear that at the time that Mallory was writing, and his audience would have recognized that, yes, some of these things are not strictly historical and may be dubious, but he still thought that they were worth reading and pondering, basically, because through them wisdom might be gained in the important subjects of life.
What do we think about the conception from this time of chivalry, of being a good knight, being a good king, being a good leader? Do we agree with their conception? Was it a Christian point of view? Is there stuff there that we would strongly disagree with?
I think a lot of the chivalric code is kind of a Christian attempt to find what means of action are most appropriate within a feudalized system. So the way that politics functioned in the medieval era was very personal. You had a lord who had vassals, and vassalage was practically universal at that point. It had developed over centuries to that point. And so this mode of governance could be done in a way that was honorable and in a way that was dishonorable. It's quite obvious if you don't have the kind of bureaucratic and administrative forms of government that we have today, but everything is one man serves one man, then there are ways in which that you can abuse your inferiors, or you can dishonor your superiors, and equally there are ways in which you can rule in a godly manner. And chivalry was an attempt to reconcile what should be good Christian personal moral conduct with this kind of political order that existed at the time. And so obviously it's not easy to directly map some of the chivalric code onto contemporary activities, because the structures of politics, like the formal structures at least, are different. And that probably requires a lot of thinking on our part of how the project of chivalry could be reapplied today given our present circumstances. Or at least that's what it seems to me to be.
Well, I also think that these stories, in the extent that they communicate about chivalry, also communicate really kind of first principles political lessons. Lessons about the foundation of order in violence, right? And the appropriate application and restraint of violence. So, I mean, there's definitely lessons about how lords interact with one another that are difficult to figure out exactly how to apply, but these kinds of basic lessons of the foundational role of violence in the state are probably more generally applicable than we might like to imagine.
Can we talk about the influence that the Arthurian legends had on the Crusades? Because I've sometimes wondered whether there's the quest for the Holy Grail. Is there some link between the Holy Grail and the Holy Land, that if you were a knight?
Yeah, so it's unclear whether this is for a forward or backward linkage, right?
Okay.
So the quest for the Holy Grail is quite connected to the phenomena of Christian pilgrims to the Holy Land. That kind of, it has a very deep history. So the justification, the nominal justification for the First Crusade is that a change in policy of the Muslims who rule the Holy Land toward Christian pilgrims. And so without that phenomena of pilgrimage, then the whole nominal justification kind of breaks down. The question is, like, is the quest for the Holy Grail a close analog to a kind of crusading impulse? I mean, they're very intimately related. I'm not sure whether the quest for the Holy Grail is influenced by Crusades, or whether Crusades are influenced by the quest for the Holy Grail in literature. It's very hard to say, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. They certainly seem to spring from a similar mindset and impulse, right?
Yeah.
So the Holy Grail, I think, is supposed to be the cup that was passed around during the Last Supper, the original
That's right,
one.
Yeah.
So for people who aren't familiar, today Christians celebrate the Lord's Supper in remembrance of the Last Supper, the last meal that Jesus has with his disciples before his crucifixion. And at that meal, he passed around a cup and said, "Drink, this is my blood and it has wine in it. Drink. This is my blood shed for you. Do this in remembrance for me. So the Holy Grail is the actual cup, supposedly, that was used. And I think there were references to a golden grail in some of the earliest versions of the Arthurian account. So this is an example of, I think, taking an element and Christianizing it. And so not only are the knights off for something made of gold, but now they're after something that has a sort of symbolic, holy significance. And in the same way, when the knights are being sent off by the Pope to retake Jerusalem, they aren't just after something that they consider to be of strategic significance, which maybe it was, but they also have in mind that there's something that this is something God wants them to acquire, and if they gain it, it will have these kind of amazing benefits to them.
Salvific power of some kind.
As we all know from Indiana Jones, the real Grail was actually made of wood. And stood in a room full of all kinds of other cups.
I suppose the.
And I mean, you short-circuited our Catholic friends on transubstantiation there. I'd be.
I suppose it is plausible that the actual cup that they used in the upper room was made out of wood, but yeah, I feel like most people, aside from Indiana Jones depictions, are thinking of a cup that's also covered in jewels and shines like the sun.
Yeah, I must admit,
they are in the upper room.
I'm not particularly familiar with first century Judean tableware. I don't know enough about what kind of cups they ordinarily would have used.
Well, fortunately, they came across just the most expensive, extravagant cup.
Yes, the one guy's house, the richest guy in Jerusalem. He had a golden toilet.
Well, don't they?
He's like, don't waste that perfume on Jesus's feet. Anyway, shing, let's drink.
Well, don't they? They also like. The upper room doesn't belong to any of the disciples. They go to a random person and like
who just happens to like, oh, we've got guests, better get our best silverware out.
We don't we don't know entirely that it was a random person. They're like because they go, Jesus tells them to go and ask a specific person, but he does so in a kind of prophetic manner. It may have been that they knew this person already, and it just happened that Jesus knew, this is where you're going to go, and
it's quite unclear from Scripture exactly, but it's not like.
But it also could have been a random guy. It's just like, yeah, sure. Jesus is coming to my pad tonight. It's happening.
Either way, the parallel here is that the knights were inspired, that like the real life knights who were being sent off to do these quests that they considered to be like of religious significance were inspired by hearing about King Arthur. So, for example, the Third Crusade, I believe, was led by what's his name? Richard. Is it the Lionheart?
Richard the Lionheart, yes.
And he was explicitly talked of in Arthurian terms as this heroic figure.
And unfortunately, may never have set foot on Albion soil. But
but as an example of the knights being explicitly told, you should be chivalrous, and here are some stories of people from ancient times, or like from your characters who you can be inspired by, who were going on exciting quests similar to the ones that you're going on, and facing similar kinds of ethical issues and questions, and the need for bravery. Like, this is, as you say, didactic but very practical for the people at this time. And then a few hundred years later, these get collected and printed and shared around.
Yeah, I think that's the fundamental purpose of all of this, and it's a very elegant parallel.
Let's talk about Excalibur. So we talked about the two ways that the sword could have come to him. My understanding is that there are some versions of the myth where these are the same sword, and some which they are different swords. And indeed, I've even heard that some versions talk about it's actually the scabbard that's of significance, and maybe that's a way of combining the two accounts. That is, like, whichever sword goes in this scabbard is going to be mythical. But either way, from a Christian perspective, what do we think about having an object like a magical sword, or like, doesn't that play into the either way you look at it? That's to me feels like a more pagan idea than a Christian idea, like the magical sword.
I mean, I'm not sure the sword really has magical properties. The sword is simply a mechanism to identify the king, right? So when the sword is held aloft out of the lake, it's not a magical sword, but the act of how he receives it is magical. When the sword is pulled from the stone, it's not a magical sword. It's kind of unclear how it got in the stone, but
Right.
it's a magic. It's a moment of divine revelation as to who the king ought to be.
Okay.
So
I
That's
think
interesting.
swords are often given a bad rep when it comes to Christianity, because I don't think the Christian perception of swords is entirely negative at all. In fact, biblically speaking, the sword as both a physical object and as a wider symbol is used in a positive sense in many cases. So some of the few that just come to mind now, without thinking too deeply about it, are the angels which guard Eden as judgment after Adam and Eve are exiled are flaming swords to prevent them from re-entering into paradise. So there's a form of like defense and guard there. The word of God is described as a sword. In fact, it's sharper than a sword. So there's this idea of a weapon that can divide that which has been knotted. It can cut things in two. I'm trying to think of other really obvious examples.
well, I think the most relevant scriptural citation here is Romans 13, where the
Yes,
the
absolutely.
sovereign is depicted as bearing the sword as an instrument of God's vengeance against evil, right? So there's a very deep Christian reason to identify the sword with sovereignty, right? The sword exists for the purposes of the sovereign to defend the people against evil, both internally against the criminal element and externally against those who would try to conquer them.
Do you have any idea why it's the sword that's always used symbolically rather than the
It's the
spear
sword.
or
It's the
pole
sword
arm or-
because at the time the Gospels are being written, it's the
Romans would have used these little stubby gladiuses, I guess.
yes,
But they
it's
also had spears.
yeah.
Well, I
But
think the sword. The importance of the sword is that it's not just a weapon, but it also is a thing which divides. A spear doesn't divide things in two, whereas a sword does.
Interesting.
So it gets used in that sort of sense in a lot of ways. That and by divides, I mean it's like the idea of discernment. They're like it's the dividing mark between good and evil and these sorts of things. So it can be used in all kinds of settings and contexts, which a spear is not really quite as fitted to.
Yes. So as you mentioned, the word of God is described as sharper than, like, living and active, sharper than a double-edged sword. I guess double-edged swords are sharper than single-edged swords. Is that the concept? I've always been slightly confused by this metaphor. I feel like if I had half an hour to sharpen a sword and I only had to sharpen one side, then I'd end up with a sharper, like the one side that I was sharpening would actually end up with a sharper edge. But I guess I'm being pedantic.
yeah,
Or does it mean that it's being sharpened on both ends, like both faces, rather than on
I'm just going to get out my
both edges?
Greek interlinear app here. To
Like,
see
are we
what it
talking
actually
about
says.
we're running up on
It's
time
Hebrews.
here.
It's Hebrews 4, right?
That's true. We've got 5 minutes left. So I guess the one other thing I wanted to talk about was the establishment of Camelot. So in the last 5 minutes, while you're looking up about the significance of a double-edged sword, is there anything significant about Camelot? I guess various places have been thought of as the location of Camelot over time. Is there anything we can learn from the function of Camelot or the way that Arthur relates to it?
I mean, this is classic personal rule. He rules from his castle in Camelot. He has his knights gathered there at the Round Table, but sends them out from his castle. There's actually not that much that I know of that's described about. I mean, he's got his. He has his kingdom, and a lot of the stories have to do with going out and defending the kingdom against monsters or druids or invaders or whatever else. But I'm not sure there's much unique about the kingdom itself, especially in the early content.
Yes, that's fair. I enjoy that when the writers are trying to make things historical and they pick a location for Camelot, they then also have to locate various other bits of the story at nearby locations.
Yeah,
So everything kind of moves like a cluster of key positions around the Isles. But you can usually find some lakes and some.
Well, this is right. Like it's generic English countryside. There's not much.
We don't have that much variety of terrain to deal with. I mean, there's King Arthur's Seat up in Scotland, and people say it's in Wales, and people locate it in, is Winchester get mentioned in some retellings as a location for Camelot?
So. But this is what I was talking about when Arthur has talked about the once and future king. One of the beauties of the Arthurian legend, in my opinion, is that it's intentionally generic. You are intended to be able to put yourself in the shoes of Arthur or one of his knights, as long as you're operating somewhere in sort of medieval Christendom. And so it's kind of intentionally not a specific place. It's intentionally, there isn't even much about it that makes it obviously England and not obviously France. So there's just not that much which is specific. In the very late discussions of Camelot, where you see it treated in like T.H. White, there's more special about the kingdom. It's more like a fairyland. But in the earlier depictions of it, where it's intended to be an actual place. And less associated with English culture than it would come to be. Like, when T.H. White is writing in the 60s, British culture, he's writing Arthur as an element of British culture rather than an element of the culture of Christendom. So that very much changes the way that Camelot is depicted. It's kind of depicted as an idealized version of the English countryside. I also think it's interesting that, particularly in the early stories, there's this. Camelot is unique because it's near the Lake of Avalon, where the spirit world and this world kind of cross over. And in some ways, Camelot is less significant than this portal to the spirit world. So I find that interesting.
I guess last question before we finish: should modern day Christians be inspired by these principles, these didactic ideas in the stories? And in particular, if you find yourself in any position of leadership, should you look to Arthur as a model for Christian kingship, like a good model?
I think there are a lot of aspects of the Arthurian legends that, yes, should be looked to by Christians for a model of good kingship. Of course, they should always be compared to what the model is, as has been given in Scripture. But the fact is that the tales we have of Arthur were written by Christian men who lived in a largely Christian age, and who themselves sought to write edifying material that would be like worthy of emulation when these figures are living up to their virtues. Obviously, the Arthurian stories, as we've talked about, have things where the various knights live in a way that's good, and things that where they don't really match up to those standards. But yeah, so I'd say yes.
I also think that one of the key things you should draw away from the Arthur stories, reading them today, is how to think about politics and organization outside of the managerial construct. So Arthur is the stories about Arthur are an idealized feudal system, but they give you a window into what it would look like to draw your loyalties personally rather than on the basis of a kind of contractual managerial construct. And I think this is very important when thinking about organizations which are fundamentally not managerial, your church, your family, etc. I think it's important to understand how to draw non-contractual loyalties.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much both for joining me.
Hold on, let's give a 10-second epilogue. I've got 2 ideas on this double-edged sword, so that.
Okay. Oh yes, sorry. I forgot about that. Let's hear it.
So the first idea is that the double-edged sword is inescapable because it cuts in both directions. That is, if you're missed on the upstroke, you'll be hit on the downstroke. There's no place you can escape from the edge of this sword. And the second is that because it cuts in both directions, it cuts in 2 different ways. So in the passage in Hebrews, in fact, it's talking about the double-edged sword. Just before then, the author of Hebrews has been talking both about the benefits of receiving the gospel and then also the judgment that comes upon those who reject it. So the word of God is has both positive and negative aspects. That is, for those who are receptive to it, it is of benefit to them, and for those who reject it, it is a judgment upon them. So those are two things with respect to a double-edged sword.
So I'm waiting for my assessment of the quality of my answers.
Yes.
Thank you so much for having us, Luke. It's been a delight, like as always.
Yeah.
And Black Horse, it's been great being on stream with you.
Yeah.
It has been great. 10 out of 10. Which
the current scores are like 16. I need to get a number up there.
Well, look, I hate that I've created a format where I end up ranking my friends, but you will be pleased to see, Black Horse, that ChatGPT in the most recent episode of the Gauntlet got the lowest score of all, and it's now at the bottom of the leaderboard. So, whilst the general format has caused some quarrels, that specific, I'm pleased to kind of put one up for human supremacy.
There you go.
The final episode of the Gauntlet's going to have a plot twist where everyone is sat around the round table and the scores are revealed to be just a fraud. They're just fake. We're all equal around the round table.
Well, I can't wait to reveal the secret channel on which I've had a panel of 6 people live reviewing and giving me the scores for each of the people as we go along.
All right, thanks, Luke.